Gideon Harrow felt the cold before he saw the house. It had already taken the feeling from his fingers. It had turned his beard to wire. It had made the world so white that the road, the sky, and the frozen riverbank had all become one single blank sheet. He had ridden 7 miles through that white emptiness, looking for a missing mule. By the time the storm pushed him sideways near the black rise above Little Crow Creek, he was no longer certain he was still riding toward home. He was not even certain he was still thinking clearly. Then his horse stumbled. Gideon came out of the saddle hard, dropped to one knee in the drift, and threw out one bare hand to stop himself from falling face first into the snow. His palm struck stone. Every winter he had ever survived told him what should happen next. At 33 below, stone was not a wall. Stone was a thief. It drank warmth straight through skin. It bit. It burned. It punished any fool desperate enough to touch it. But this stone did not bite. Under his cracked palm, in the middle of a killing blizzard, the wall held a warmth that should have been impossible. Not the heat of a stove, not the comfort of a fire. Something smaller than that, a stubborn, patient memory of heat. Gideon Harrow stood in the screaming snow with his hand pressed flat against the house he had called madness all summer, and for the first time in 10 years, the thing inside him that he had mistaken for wisdom began to break. But that moment did not begin in the storm. It began 8 months earlier, when Mara Whitcomb walked into the land office with $28 sewn into her coat lining and bought the one piece of ground in Holland Bend that no sensible person wanted. A ruin. That was the word the clerk used. A stone ruin on the north bank of Little Crow Creek, left from an old stage station that had burned before the railroad came through and made the road useless. The roof was gone. The door was gone. One corner had sunk. Grass grew from the joints. The walls stood only because they had not yet figured out how to fall. 27 feet by 40. Black fieldstone. Almost 2 feet thick in the lowest courses. To most people, it was a pile of cold rock with legal paperwork attached. To Mara Whitcomb, it was the first honest answer she had seen in 2 winters, because the cabin her husband left behind had never been a home after he died. It had been a wooden box that needed feeding every hour. Eben Whitcomb had built it fast their first autumn in the basin, the way men built when the first freeze was hunting them. He had promised to finish the chinking properly in spring. Spring came, then planting, then fence work, then a fever, then a grave. By the second winter without him, Mara knew every sound a cold house could make. She knew the thin whistle under the sill, the dry pop of pine shrinking at midnight, the small crack of ice forming inside a water pail before dawn. She knew how a room could be warm near the stove and dangerous 4 steps away. Her boy, Tom, slept in his coat with his boots within reach, because cold had taught him there was no such thing as fully undressed. Her daughter, Clara, 16 and already tired in the way grown women are tired, stopped complaining first. That was what frightened Mara most. A child still complaining believed someone could fix the thing. Clara had gone quiet. One January morning, Mara found frost on the inside of the girl's blanket, a white lace along the wool where her breath had settled and frozen. Clara brushed it away before her mother could speak, as if there was nothing to say about it. That night, Mara sat by a dying stove and counted, not prayers, not hopes, sticks of wood. She counted how many they burned in 1 week, how many cords remained, how many weeks of winter were still standing between them and mud season. Then she counted the years ahead. If they stayed in that cabin, every winter would demand the same tax. More chopping, more hauling, more sleepless nights. More heat poured into a room that handed it back to the dark the moment the flames sank. A house that only lived while the stove was burning was not shelter. It was a debt. And Mara Whitcomb had watched her husband pay that debt until his body had no savings left. So when she stood beside the old stage station wall in April and laid her palm against the southern face, she did not feel ruin. She felt afternoon stored in stone. The sun had been gone behind cloud for nearly an hour, but the rock still gave back a low warmth into her hand. Mara closed her eyes. For 1 second, she was 9 years old again in her mother's brick yard in Ohio, standing beside a clamp kiln before sunrise, her small palm pressed to fired clay that still held yesterday's heat. Her mother had told her then, "Fire is careless if you let it run, but brick remembers." Mara had not understood the sentence until she felt it. Now, 25 years later, widowed, nearly broke, and tired of waking her children in a house that leaked life into the dark, she understood it with her whole body. By sunset, she had made her offer. By morning, the clerk had written the deed. By that evening, Holland Bend had something new to laugh about. The story traveled faster than rain. Mara Whitcomb had bought the burned stage ruin. Mara Whitcomb meant to put a roof on it. Mara Whitcomb planned to live inside the stone itself. Not beside it, not behind it, inside it. The men at Vale's Mill named it before she set the first trowel of mortar, Mara's Ice Vault. Pike Latham said it loudest, because Pike had a gift for finding the phrase that would be repeated by people too lazy to invent their own. By Sunday, children were saying it on the church road. By Monday, Clara heard 2 women say it over a flour barrel and walked home with her face burning hotter than the July sun. Mara pretended not to notice. There was too much work to do. The first men rode out in May. Gideon Harrow came with them, though he told himself he had come only to prevent harm. He was the best carpenter in 3 townships, a man whose opinion could raise a roof or kill alone. If Gideon shook his head over a plan, that plan was already half buried. Beside him rode Orson Vale, who owned the mill and saw the world in bored feet. And Pike Latham came, because mockery tastes better when taken fresh. They found Mara kneeling in a trench, mixing lime, sand, creek gravel, and chopped flax fiber into a gray paste that clung to her trowel. Her sleeves were rolled, her hands were white with lime. Her skirt was damp to the knees from creek water. She did not stand when their horses stopped. Gideon watched the wall for a long time. He was not a cruel man. That almost made it worse. "Stone belongs under a house," he said at last, "not around a family. That wall will pull the warmth out of your fire faster than pine ever would." He spoke gently, like a man explaining a cliff edge to someone walking in fog. Orson Vale leaned forward in his saddle. "I have seasoned pine waiting in town," he said. "Good, straight boards. I can put a load here by Thursday. You could have a proper cabin closed before first frost." Pike laughed. "Let her finish it," he said. "Come July, we can cut ice from the creek and store it right in her parlor." The other two men did not laugh as hard as Pike wanted, but they laughed enough. Mara stood then, slowly. The southern wall was warm behind her from the afternoon sun. She laid one scarred palm against it and looked up at the three mounted men. "This stone saves the day after the day is gone," she said. That was all. She did not explain the brickyard. She did not explain the frozen water pail. She did not explain that pine gave warmth nowhere to live. She had learned something about men who arrive already certain. If you give them reasons, they use the reasons as handles to carry your foolishness back to town. So she turned back to the wall. The men rode away with a joke because she had refused to give them an argument. And all through June, the joke grew. Mara worked from the ground upward. That was the first lesson her mother had taught her. A wall fails at the place nobody wants to look. She dug around the old foundation until the lowest stones showed their faces. She pulled out every loose rock and stacked them by size. She reset the bottom courses over creek gravel so water could pass below instead of sitting under the wall like a hidden enemy. Tom hauled small stone from the creek until his arms trembled. He was 10, narrow-shouldered, and proud to be necessary. Clara carried water twice a day and resentment all day long. She hated the ruin. She hated the nickname. She hated the way riders slowed on the creek road to watch them work, as if the three Whitcombs were a traveling show. Most of all, she hated that part of her still wanted her mother to be right. Hope made a person vulnerable. Clara knew that by then. There was an aunt in St. Paul who had once written that Clara could come stay if times grew too hard. In Clara's mind, that city became a warm place with glass windows, real lamps, dry streets, and no one whispering "ice vault" when she entered a store. She kept the idea hidden the way another girl might keep a ribbon. Mara kept her own hidden thing in a small oilcloth notebook. At first, it held only measurements: wall depth, sun hours, mortar mix, wood left at the old cabin. Later, it held stranger things: where the cat slept. The cat's name was Button, because Tom had named him when he was 5, and the animal had been small enough to fit inside Eben's coat pocket. By summer, Button was a scarred gray barn cat with one torn ear and no sentimental loyalty to anyone. He liked comfort. He liked food. He liked warm places. That made him, in Mara's mind, the most honest engineer in Holland Bend. On cool evenings, while the men in town swore the stone would freeze her children solid, Button stretched along the southern wall long after sunset and slept with his belly pressed to the rock. Mara wrote it down. Clara saw her do it once and said, "You're keeping account of a cat now." Mara did not look up. "A cat spends no pride on being wrong," she said. Clara rolled her eyes, but she remembered the line. By late July, 3 walls stood mended nearly to shoulder height, and the worst of the old ruin had begun to look like a decision. That was when the rain corrected her. It came for 2 days without thunder, a dull, patient rain that did not frighten horses or flatten grass, only searched. It searched every joint, every slope, every assumption Mara had carried north from the brickyards, where rain was a nuisance, not a weapon. On the 3rd morning, she found the north corner slumped outward, not collapsed, worse, shifted. The new mortar had washed from the lowest joints. 2 stones had rolled half free. A dark line of standing water hugged the foundation. Mara stood in the rain and stared at it. A small failure can tell the truth better than a large one. This one said she had built a warm wall in the path of cold water. Button came out from under a wagon, sniffed the wet corner, shook one paw with disgust, and walked to the east wall to sit. Mara watched him choose against her. That hurt more than Pike's jokes. By noon, Pike had ridden past. By evening, the whole town knew that Mara's ice vault had started melting in a summer shower. Gideon came the next day. Again, he did not gloat. He crouched by the wound in the wall, pressed his thumb into the soaked soil, and read the damage the way a doctor reads fever. When he stood, his knees cracked. "Water starts what frost finishes," he said. It was true. That was the cruelest thing about it. Mara could survive insults. She could not talk her way around truth. So she said nothing. She took the wall apart, stone by stone. 6 weeks of labor came down in a single day, and Clara watched from the doorway with her arms folded tight against herself. Something in the girl's face closed. That night, after Tom fell asleep, Clara took a sheet of good paper from the chest and wrote the first line of a letter. "Dear Aunt Lenny." Then she wrote the sentence she had been carrying for months. "I do not think we will live through another winter here." The pen stopped there. Outside in the dark, her mother was still moving stones by lantern light. Not rebuilding, not yet. Undoing, listening to the land. Mara spent the next morning walking the slope with a charred stick, marking where the rain had traveled. She knelt in mud. She followed little veins of water through grass. She watched where they gathered, where they slowed, where they turned toward the house as if the ruin itself had called them home. Then she saw it. The old station had been set in a shallow bowl, not enough for a rider to notice, enough for winter to use. Every rain that fell north of the ruin moved toward the foundation. Every thaw did the same. Water had been carrying itself to the wall for years, soaking the earth, waiting for frost to become a pry bar. Maybe that was why the stage station failed. Not fire alone, not age. Water first, frost second. Gravity always. Mara sat back on her heels in the mud. Her idea had not been wrong. Her arrogance had been. She had trusted stone and ignored ground. That afternoon she started the house again, not with stone, with a ditch. A deep drain cut along the north side, bent around the corner, and carried down toward the creek. She lined it with broken rock and covered it with coarse gravel. She changed the soil slope with a shovel and 2 tired children, pulling the land itself away from the wall by inches. The work did not look like progress. That bothered the town because the town liked progress with a roofline. But progress is sometimes a thing hidden underground, doing its job precisely because no one can see it. Mara changed the mortar too. Harder outside, softer inside. A shell to shed rain. A heart to move with the stone when cold made everything swell and shrink. When Tom asked why the same wall needed two kinds of strength, Mara pressed mortar into a joint and said, "A thing that cannot bend will brag until winter teaches it to crack." The boy nodded with the solemn face of a child saving a sentence for later. Clara pretended not to listen. But she listened. The north corner was rebuilt by September. Button inspected it 3 dry evenings in a row. On the 4th, he slept against it. Mara wrote that down. Clara saw the entry and did not laugh this time. The roof made Holland Bend certain again, certain that Mara had gone from foolish to dangerous. A proper roof rose upward. A proper roof gave a man a ridgepole and a room high enough to stand proud inside. Mara built low. She laid cottonwood beams across the stone span, thick, close set, and ugly to anyone who loved clean carpentry. Over the beams she packed willow lattice. Over the willow, prairie hay. Over the hay, 16 inches of sod cut from the slope in heavy black bricks. By the time she finished, the house seemed less built than buried. From the creek road, it looked like the hillside had grown a door. Pike called it a family grave with a chimney. That one did not get the laughter he expected. Even men who enjoyed cruelty could feel when a joke stepped too near children. Orson Vale shook his head and said a low house would hold damp, hold rats, hold sickness. Gideon said nothing. His silence carried farther than both of them. By then, he had begun waking cold in his own perfect house. Not freezing, not unsafe, just cold enough to remember. And that was the trouble. Gideon had built his reputation on tight joints, seasoned logs, square corners, and the belief that a good wooden house was the best answer a family could give to winter. But some beliefs are not born from proof. Some are born from grief. 10 years before, in another county, Gideon had built the first house he was truly proud of. He had built it for his wife and the daughter sleeping in a cradle beside their bed. The logs were clean, the chinking was tight, the roof did not leak. And still, during a cold snap that dropped the glass below 30, his daughter took a cough that turned to fever and would not let go. He fed the stove until the pipe glowed. His wife held the child 4 feet from the fire. 4 feet. That distance stayed in him. Not the miles he later traveled west. Not the years. 4 feet. The length between a burning stove and a child who could not get warm enough to stay. Afterward, Gideon made a law out of his grief. He decided hope was dangerous unless it was made from things he understood. So when he saw Mara building a house out of stone, he did not only see foolishness, he saw a mother risking children on a theory. And he had no mercy for theories. He thought that made him wise. Mara finished the roof 2 days before the first hard frost. Inside, she did the one thing that made even Clara stare. She built the hearth against the north wall. Not in the center of the room, not where the fire would throw heat evenly into the air. Against the coldest wall. Tom asked if that meant the wall would steal the fire. Yes, Mara said. He looked alarmed. She smiled for the first time in days. Tonight it steals. At dawn, it pays back. The hearth was not large. That was another offense to local judgment. A small fire looked like surrender in that country. But Mara did not want flames roaring up a chimney. She wanted coals. She wanted stone behind them. She wanted heat moving backward into the wall, slow as sap, and returning through the night on a clock no pine board could keep. When the first frost came, she hung 2 thermometers, one by the door, one on the shelf near the far wall. Then she began the winter account. Outside at dusk, inside at dusk. Outside before dawn, inside before dawn. Wood used. Coals alive or dead. Water pail, frozen or clear. Butter hard or cuttable. And button, always button. Where button slept was the final column. On the first cold week, the town's cabins burned loud and hot at supper, then woke mean before dawn. Mara's stone house did not leap warm, it gathered. The first evening, Clara complained that the fire felt too small. By midnight, she stopped complaining. By morning, the water pail had no ice, not even a skin. Outside, the glass read 14 degrees. Inside, 49. The fire had gone to coals hours earlier. The room had not fallen with it. Mara read the number 3 times before she wrote it down. She did not cheer. There was no audience. She pressed her pencil to the page carefully because her hand had started to shake. The next night was colder. Inside held. The next, colder again. Inside still held. Not hot, not cheerful, not summer. Safe. There are kinds of warmth that make a person smile, and there are kinds of warmth that make a mother sit very still because her child is asleep in the corner without a coat. Clara noticed against her will. She noticed Tom slept with one arm out from under the blanket. She noticed the corners did not feel like another country. She noticed her own jaw no longer ached before sunrise. That angered her, because the letter in her mattress still existed. A person preparing to leave needs the place behind her to keep proving why. The stone house refused. One night, Mara found the letter while mending Clara's mattress seam. She read only the first sentence. Then she folded it back exactly. After supper, she put the oilcloth notebook beside Clara's plate. "Read the account," she said, "not because I say so, because numbers do not care whether I am your mother." Clara stared at it. Mara added, "If you read every page and still think this house will cost you your life, I will take you to the train myself when the road opens." Clara did not answer. She did not open the notebook that night, but she did not push it away. And in a house built from stubborn things, sometimes not pushing away is the first joining. The real winter came in late December, not with pretty snow, with a front that seemed to drop out of the north as one complete command. The sky lowered, the wind sharpened. Then the whole basin vanished under a moving white wall. At the postal shed 12 miles north, the thermometer reached 37 below before the glass clouded with frost. Fences disappeared. Cattle drifted with their backs to the wind and vanished into low ground. Men tied ropes between house and barn because a person could be lost 10 steps from his own door. In Holland Bend, jokes froze first. No one said ice vault at the store, because no one had spare breath for cleverness. Stoves ate wood as if starving. Pails froze indoors. Families pulled beds into the center of rooms. Dogs abandoned thresholds and slept with noses nearly in the ash. In Gideon Harrow's house, the joints were tight. He had made sure of that. The chinking was new. The logs were chosen and seasoned. The stove was a good iron one, bought with pride and maintained with discipline. Still, the cold gathered in the corners. Still, Gideon rose every hour, then every 40 minutes. Then he stopped sleeping at all. On the fourth night, he sat before his stove with the split log across his knees and did not put it in. He let the flame lower. He let himself feel what he had spent a decade refusing to feel. His best work had not failed because he was careless. It had failed because wood alone was always living moment to moment. A wooden wall could block wind. It could not store mercy. The thought hurt so sharply that he stood up to escape it. There was nowhere in the room to go. Across the basin, under 16 inches of frozen earth, Mara's house had grown quiet. That was the strangest part. There was no heroic roaring fire, no stovepipe glowing, no panic. A small bed of coals breathed beneath ash. A low flame moved only when Mara fed it. The air stood still. Not dead, still, the way a sleeping child is still. Tom lay on a pallet beside the east wall, 1 foot outside his blanket. Clara sat at the table with the notebook open. Button slept against the southern wall, 10 feet from the hearth, utterly uninterested in the fire. Outside, the wind scraped at the buried roof. Inside, the water pail stayed black and liquid. Near dawn on the fourth night, Mara lifted the lamp to the door thermometer. Outside, 35 below. Inside, 51. She stood there until the lamp chimney warmed her fingers. The coals had been coals since midnight. No flame. The house had carried them through the blackest part of the storm on heat that had already been saved. Clara woke and watched her mother write the number. Then she rose without putting on her coat. She did not notice that she had done it. That was the miracle Mara noticed. The habit was gone before the girl had time to argue with it. Clara crossed to the wood stack and lifted the split log she had placed there before bed, the one she had expected they would need before dawn. It sat unused. She held it in both hands. Then she put it back. Not carelessly, deliberately. Like a person returning money she had discovered she did not have to spend. Mara saw. She said nothing. Some forms of belief are too new to survive being named. On the 5th day of the front, Gideon's mule broke through a drifted fence. A wiser man would have let the animal go. Gideon had lost one small life to cold already. He could not sit by a fire and lose another without trying. He saddled his bay gelding and rode into a world without edges. The tracks lasted less than a minute before the wind filled them. The creek bends vanished. The old cottonwoods appeared and disappeared like ghosts. More than once Gideon turned in a circle and could not tell whether home lay ahead of him or behind. Cold is patient at first. It asks for fingertips, then ears, then the face, then thought. By late afternoon, Gideon had begun answering questions no one had asked. He knew this was dangerous. Knowing did not make his hands work. The horse stumbled near the rise above Little Crow Creek. A black shape lifted out of the white, low, buried, half earth, half shadow. Mara's house. He almost rode past it. A proper house announces itself. This one only endured. The wind struck him broadside, and he fell more than dismounted, catching himself against the wall with one bare hand, and stone answered him. Not with fire, with refusal. It refused to steal from him. That was what broke him. The whole country was taking. The snow took sight, the wind took breath, the saddle leather took skin. His own house had taken wood all week and given back only brief hours of safety. But this wall held. A faint, impossible warmth lived under the frozen surface, as if the stone had hidden a coal too deep for the storm to find. Gideon pressed his palm harder, then his forearm, then his shoulder. He stood there with snow hammering his back and understood, not in his mind, but in his bones, that Mara had not built a tomb. She had built a memory with walls. And if a wall could remember heat, then his law had been wrong all the way down. He found the door by touch and knocked so weakly Mara almost did not hear it. When she opened, no blast of furnace heat rushed out. That surprised him nearly as much as the wall. A desperate house throws heat out the moment the door opens. This one did not. The air inside was steady. The cold came in on Gideon's coat, but it did not take the room. Clara looked up from slicing bread, saw the most respected builder in Holland Bend standing half-frozen in their doorway, and did not move in alarm. Tom rose to take the horse rope. Button opened one eye, judged the visitor unimportant, and closed it again against the warm stone. Gideon stepped inside. His builder's eyes searched for the trick. There had to be one. A hidden stove, a roaring back room, a woodpile murdered to ash. But the hearth was modest. The water pail stood far from the fire, unfrozen. The thermometer near the door read an impossible number. And the wood stack was still there. After 5 days of the worst cold he had known in years, most of it remained. Gideon looked at it the way a man looks at a witness who has just told the truth he feared most. "How much?" he asked. His voice cracked around the words. Mara took the oilcloth notebook from the shelf and placed it in his hands. He could hardly turn the pages, but he read. Outside numbers, inside numbers. Wood used by count, not by hope. Coals kept. Water clear. Cat at south wall. Cat near north wall. Cat away from hearth. He read the ledger of a house he had mocked and found no speech in him. Evidence has a way of leaving no room for dignity. Mara gave him a chair near the hearth and a bowl of stew. She did not ask for an apology. That would have been smaller than what was happening. Late that night, with the children asleep and the storm still dragging its claws over the roof, Gideon told her about the first house he had built. He told her about the girl in the cradle. The cough, the fire he fed until his hands blistered, the 4 feet between flame and child. He He told it without tears at first. Then he said, "I shook my head at you because I thought I was protecting your children from hope." His mouth trembled once. "And you were protecting them from the thing I never learned how to fight." Mara sat across from him in the low red light. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she said, "Nobody is born knowing where heat goes." Gideon bowed his head. The stone wall behind him gave back the day's saved warmth inch by inch through the dark. For the first time in 6 nights, the old carpenter slept until morning. The front broke on the 6th day. It did not fade. It simply stopped. The wind dropped and Holland Bend came out of its houses stunned by silence. People counted losses. Chickens frozen on roosts. Calves buried in drifts. Wood piles cut in half. Frostbite on ears, cheeks, fingers. Children kept warm by labor that had nearly broken the adults doing it. Then they gathered at Vale's store, because people who survive together need to explain survival to one another. Pike Latham was the first to reach for the old joke. "Well," he said, rubbing his hands by the stove, "I suppose Mara's ice vault didn't turn solid after all." A few men made small sounds that wanted to be laughter. They died before becoming anything. The joke tasted different now. Everyone in that room had spent 5 nights learning how thin a wooden wall could feel. The door opened. Gideon Harrow came in, still raw-faced from the storm. The room turned toward him by instinct. They expected the old, slow headshake, the one that had settled arguments for years. Gideon unwound his scarf and stood beside the stove without warming his hands. "Any man building north of the creek this spring," he said, "ought to ride out and put his bare hand on Mara Whitcomb's wall before he buys his first load of lumber." No one moved. Orson Vale's face tightened. "You telling men not to build with pine now?" Gideon looked at him. "No," he said. "I'm telling them pine is not the whole answer. And the cold does not care what I used to believe." That sentence did more than any speech Mara could have made. Not because it was clever, because it cost him. A younger settler near the flour barrels tried to save everyone's pride. "So what do we call it then?" he asked. "A Harrow wall?" Gideon turned on him so sharply the young man stepped back. "No." The word was flat. "It is a Whitcomb wall. I am only the man who is wrong about it in public." That was the name that stayed. Not because the town was generous, because Gideon forced the truth into the room before anyone could steal it. By spring, wagons began climbing the track to Mara's house for reasons other than mockery. Men asked about the drain first, because men prefer to begin with something they can dig. Then the roof. Then the wall thickness. Then the hearth. Mara answered what mattered and ignored what did not. Clara often answered for her. She explained the gravel trench, the north wall, the difference between throwing heat into air and banking it into stone. She explained why standing water beside a foundation was not water at all once January came. It was a hammer waiting to freeze. The girl who had written to leave became the one who kept the winter notebook. Her handwriting was neater than Mara's. By the second winter, 3 new cabins in Holland Bend had stone-backed hearths. By the third, men were banking earth against north walls instead of building tall, empty rooms for pride to echo in. By the fifth, Vale's mill sold fewer wallboards, but more heavy roof beams. And Orson Vale, being a practical man, discovered that profit could survive being wrong. He never said Mara had been right. He simply stopped saying she was not. Gideon changed most visibly. He did not abandon timber. He loved it too honestly for that. He taught men how to use it better. Pine for span, stone for memory, drainage before pride. A low roof where a high one only gave heat more room to escape. He carried children in his arms sometimes when he visited Mara's house, and if one slept against his shoulder in that steady warmth, he would look toward the north wall with a grief that no longer had to defend itself. Mara never became the sort of woman the town expected to admire. Admiration did not soften her. It did not make her speak more. It did not teach her to enjoy being right. She had not built the wall to defeat men. She had built it to keep two children from waking cold. That remained the measure of it. Years later, people in Holland Bend would speak of the Whitcomb Wall as if it had always made sense. That is how communities forgive themselves. They pretend the truth arrived earlier than it did. But Clara kept the old letter. She did not burn it. A girl who had not yet seen proof was not a fool for wanting escape. She was only cold. And Mara, who had learned from rain, from stone, from cats, from numbers, and from winter itself, understood that no person should be mocked for not knowing a thing before the world has shown it to them. What the basin learned was not that stone was warm. Stone can be cruelly cold. They learned something harder and more useful. A house made only of thin walls lives in the present tense. While the fire burns, the room lives. When the flame dies, the warmth leaves with it. But a wall with weight keeps a slower clock. It gathers afternoon. It drinks the coals. It saves what other houses throw away. Then, when the north wind comes down and the fire has gone quiet, and children are deep in the dark beyond midnight, that wall begins its patient work. Not loudly. Not proudly, a degree at a time. Mara Whitcomb never beat winter. No one in that country ever truly did. She did something smaller and better. She taught yesterday's warmth to stand watch until morning.